Music has long been a form of protest and empowerment. And on this day, August 1st, in 1934, a musician by the name of Huddie Ledbetter, better known as Leadbelly, was released from Angola prison following a petition for his release along with recordings of his music. And today, artists are still using their platforms to fight for racial justice. I'm Dometi Pongo, and over the next few weeks, we'll be drawing parallels between these significant moments in history and what we see happening on the streets today. History can give us the context to better understand what we're living through today. I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak to one of our country's leading historians about how understanding our history can help us to move forward. I'll be in conversation with Lonnie Bunch, who's the first African-American secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African-American History and Culture. Who was Leadbelly and why is he so important to these conversations about music as a form of protest?
Well, Leadbelly was someone who loved to play the guitar and found the blues. And by finding the blues, he found his voice. And his songs are songs that tell us about what it's like to be black and to be a sharecropper, what it's like to be black and have to face racial discrimination. And because he was in prison several times, it was also, his songs tell us about all those black men that got caught up in the criminal justice system who were put on chain gangs. And so in some way, his music is captured partly because it's the best representation of a particular genre, but also because it really is the music that is both of resiliency and pain. And in some ways, his music captured what life was like for Black Americans in the early 20th century.
Let the midnight special shine a light on me. Let the midnight special shine a heaven loving light on me.
What Leadbelly experienced when he was incarcerated in that Angola prison reminds me so much of Meek Mill's incarceration and how afterward, to this day, Meek has become, an advocate for prison reform and a voice against mass incarceration through his reform initiative. What happened with Leadbelly for folks who aren't familiar with his history, and why was he incarcerated, and what was that movement like for him to be freed and for his music to come to the forefront?
Well, in some ways, Leadbelly ran afoul of a system that had taken so many African-American men, the convict lease system, right? That this was the way that prisons were able to sort of rent out their labor. To build the roads in the South, to build buildings. And so there was a great desire to snap up people like Leadbelly. And what I think is so powerful, though, is that Leadbelly's music was one of the reasons he ultimately was let free, because basically the Library of Congress came down and taped Leadbelly's music. People saw it, in a way, they saw it as authentic. He really illuminates the penal system. And that suddenly it's not they're just criminals, but they're people who a system breaks. They're people who a system unfairly incarcerates without knowing when they can be free. And that in essence, what you now see are other rappers who talk about mass incarceration. That's what Leadbelly was talking about. They just didn't call it mass incarceration. And I think both, so what you see with Leadbelly is a sense of, let me illuminate where I see evil, and I see evil in the prison system.
If you ever go to Houston, boy, you better walk right, and you better not squabble, and you better not fight. Bed Rocker will arrest you, hit the boom and take it down. You can bet your bottom dollar that you're sugar land bound. Let the midnight.
What's so dope about Leadbelly, as I researched him, as I study him, I had a black studies professor in college that always had us, he didn't even let us listen to his lyrics first, he let us read them first. And there were so many parallels between Leadbelly and rappers. He reminds me of an MC. There's a grittiness, there's the understanding of the underbelly of society, this window into mass incarceration, as you mentioned. And, you know, when you think of protest music, you know, a lot of times we think about songs like We Shall Overcome, we think about Negro spirituals, Change Gonna Come by Sam Cooke. And then you have another sector of protest music that has a different kind of aggression, where the anguish and pain is manifested and explained differently. You can talk about the array of protest music and how it feels and sounds differently and hits different parts of us in several ways.
Well, music is so important on so many levels. On the one hand, it's about protest. But on the other hand, the music is also about community and gives people common understanding and common ground. And so what I find so powerful, for example, is talking to someone like Bernice Johnson Reagan, who was part of the Freedom Singers, and she talked powerfully about during the 60s, they would be in a church and they'd be surrounded by people who wanted to do them harm. And they would sing these songs of protest to give them a sense of strength, a sense of possibility they could move forward.
Stand on freedom and woke up this morning with the mind. Stand on freedom.
On the other hand, then you get people who are shaped by the desire to protest and frame the music a little differently.
If I never make it, Lord knows I won't never stop. Sometimes I fall flat down on my face. Get up, get back in the race. I'm all alone. I've got to hold on. Oh, Lord knows.
So for me, what I see in this music is really an opportunity to capture the fears, the hopes, capture the pain. And by capturing that pain, you're motivating people to continue to struggle. At the very least, what you're doing is letting people know they're not alone. To me, it's really, you don't have successful protest movements without the music.
We all live black and white. Yeah. To fight for equal rights. Yeah. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on.
You touched on something poignant in that first anecdote about how the music will placate the oppressors in different ways. And there's a parallel for that today where it seems there's a segment of white America that loves black art, but doesn't love black people.
Yes, Lord. I wish they loved black people as much as they love black culture.
You know? And how has I think that the window into society where we're seeing the younger people become more open to conversations about racial justice, it's because of this understanding that there is this relationship to black culture, that they have to reckon with all of the elements of black culture. How has America's love for black culture given us a window to talk about some of these other issues?
Well, it's done many things. On the one hand, you could make an argument that things like Motown, the music of the late 50s and 60s, introduced so many white teenagers to black culture. Now, it was a romanticized black culture, but it was black culture nonetheless, and it was considered radical for these white kids to buy this music. And I love how Motown early didn't use pictures of blacks on their album covers. But the notion was that this kind of music would introduce you, if you were white, to a world that you would never have any other contact with. One of the challenges today is that you do see more people crossing those racial lines. So the music is still an introductory doorway to many, but more have relationships and cross lines than, let's say, 50 years ago. But I would argue that what the music does, especially protest music, it legitimizes the efforts by making clear that this is what's going on. It's allowing people to hear the challenges in a way that they wouldn't by reading about it or looking at the newspaper. And what it does is it allows you to tap your toes and still be in the fight for social justice.
That's right. A good example of that is Kendrick Lamar's We Gon' Be Alright. And I remember going to a march and hearing that song erupt into protest. And it's like it was a mix of joy, it was a mix of passion, it was a mix of anger and confusion as the officers are looking like, you know, what's, yeah, and people are yelling this out.
We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright.
It reminded me of something I've seen the folks at the Smithsonian say before, that hip hop is folk music, that it's a musical revolution that embodies the voice of an entire generation. So it comes as no surprise that you guys are putting together an anthology of hip hop. What would that entail? What does that look like? Who are some of the folks that you guys are featuring? What artifacts can I see? I'm gonna go there and nerd out. Like, what's the situation behind that?
One of the things that we realized is that hip hop really is the music of several generations now. And it is a music that is urban. It's the music of anger and hope. And it's the music that you can tap your toes to. And so what we want to do is we recognize that hip hop and rap are crucially important. And yet there are large segments of the population who think, what is that music? They don't know it. And they think it's something that's maybe not as good as Smokey Robinson or Pat Boone. But the Smithsonian is the great legitimizer. So there are going to be people who will come to it who wouldn't have come to it without this. And we want to make sure then that we tell the stories. If you go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you'll see material from LL Cool J and NWA and Chuck D. And so we think that it was important to say this music is part of the sweep of the African American experience. This is all part of a tradition that tries very hard to capture the best of what a community is, but also challenges the community and the country to not accept where it is.
There's something powerful, Secretary Bunch, about having you there in particular as a founding member of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, in really cementing all elements of our culture, what some consider fringe elements, and legitimizing them. You know, what is it about, the fringe elements of music and the rebellious nature of youth-led movements, the rebellious nature of Tupac Shakur, that appeals to so many segments of society and kind of, puts hip-hop in this space where even with its problematic elements, it's a driving force for protest and social justice and change?
I think, first of all, as you framed it, it's the music of several generations. So those generations immediately feel connected, immediately recognize the crisis that you're in, the challenges that you face, and that ultimately what this does more than anything else is that it inspires people to feel a sense of community and to use that community to push for change. In some ways, what I think the strength of rap and hip hop historically has been, when you look at some of the soul music of the 60s, it had to make the rough edges smooth. You compare Motown to, Stax, which was rougher, which was truer to a Southern black experience. But what you find in rap and hip hop is you find music that is as true as it can be. And that, to me, is unbelievably powerful.
And I see beauty in hip hop and in the history of black music as a protest, man. I appreciate what you guys are doing at the Smithsonian with this.
Thank you.
This is dope. That's dope. I'm so excited about that conversation, man. I'm a hip hop head, Secretary. I mean,
I got you.
I love that. I love that conversation.